Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can take us wherever you go on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you find your podcast content. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, you can always check out what's going on in studio by visiting our YouTube channel. Smash down on that like button, subscribe, leave a comment. And if you, as we always like, is the word of mouth. So let your friends know and your family members know and your family members' friends and your friends' family members know how much you enjoy the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. Joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating discussion all about reconciliation. We're going to get into what that means, is Hazen Marshall. He's the founding partner of Marshall & Pop and one of Washington's leading policy experts with over 3 decades of experience in legislative policy and strategic consulting. He served as policy director to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, where he played key roles in major legislative achievements, including the Tax Cuts and Job Acts, in terms of healthcare reform, and the Bipartisan Budget Acts of 2015 and 2018. He's an expert in the Senate rules, congressional budgeting, and reconciliation with a deep understanding of tax, economic, and appropriations policy. Prior to his consulting career, he spent over 20 years in the Senate, including as staff director to the Senate Budget Committee and chief of staff to Senator Don Nichols. Hazen, it's so great to have you on. And why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about what reconciliation is and how it came about and why it's important?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me today, Andrew. This is one of those subjects that doesn't come up very often in DC every few years. But when it does, suddenly everybody kind of scrambles because it's one of those procedural things that it's very confusing to a lot of folks, but sure. I for better or worse, I sadly lived through many of these reconciliation bills over the course of my career, and so sometimes after you go through it so many times, it starts to sink in. So reconciliation is got its start with the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, which I always found it kind of fascinating that, from literally the beginning of the country until 1974, the Congress had no budget process. Wow. They relied entirely upon the executive branch to come up with a budget and then to try to follow that budget. And so it literally wasn't until 1974 that they finally said, we should probably have a budget process of our own. And so part of the Congressional Budget Act was, Congress would come up with its budget. They wanted to have a way to make it easier for Congress to stick with the budget that they came up with. And so they put in the reconciliation process, the purpose of which is it gives you the ability to have a privileged vehicle in the Senate that gets around the usual full debate, full amendment rules of the Senate. So it lets you get around the filibuster. With reconciliation, you can pass a bill in the Senate with a simple majority. Consideration of the bill is time limited. There are no limits on the number of amendments, but eventually members run out of steam and the amendment process ends, and then you pass the bill. And so they wanted to give Congress that ability so that they could do hard things to comply with their budget. And for the first couple of decades that they used the process, that's pretty much what it was used for. It was to do the heavy lifting of deficit reduction. And those bills were generally done and passed on a bipartisan basis. And that continued all the way into the 90s. But it's changed a lot in the years since then. It is now mostly used when one party or the other has a trifecta or has complete control of the legislative and executive branches. They use the reconciliation process to enact a partisan agenda
Yeah.
that they can get through the Senate with a simple majority. And we've seen that over the last number of years. Obviously, Republicans have taken advantage of it for that purpose. Democrats have taken advantage of it for that purpose.
It's interesting because we now know, in the wake of the Loper-Bright decision with the Supreme Court, right, for the longest time, there was no real check on executive branch interpretation of statute, right? That as long as they can make some kind of tangential relationship to something. I mean, this goes along with the expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause under the the Constitution, in terms of the nexus between interstate commerce for laws. Loper-Bright obviously placed a massive check on power in the 90s in the Supreme Court. We saw a check on sort of the Commerce Clause interpretation, but there seems to be no check on the use of reconciliation for things that have nothing to do with budgetary issues. Or am I not understanding it correctly?
Well, that's actually been a big part of the process. It wasn't in the original when they originally created it in the Budget Act, but a number of years after reconciliation had been used, Senator Byrd from West Virginia,
yes,
who, as you know, was a procedural mastermind. He recognized that, because this is an exception to the general filibuster rule, that you probably needed to have some sort of check on what could be included in a reconciliation bill. And he ended up coming up with the Byrd rule, as it's known to us budget nerds, that is now in a part of the law. And the Byrd rule has 7 tests that a provision must comply with in order to be in a reconciliation bill. If a provision is deemed to have failed any of those tests, it is deemed to be extraneous, and any senator can raise a point of order and can have that stricken from the bill unless they can get 60 votes to waive the point of order. So it's a way to take provisions out of a bill that might not otherwise comply. And the Byrd rule gets into it has lots of nuances to it. I would just say that the simplest way to think about it is on a threshold level, a provision must have some budgetary impact in order to be in a reconciliation bill. And so that's a threshold hurdle. And many provisions of law that members want to see done obviously don't have a budgetary impact. But the nuance then that we fight a lot about is the provision must also, that budgetary impact must be more important than the policy impact of the provision. It's a merely incidental test. And that is what the staff and members and the House and Senate spend most of their time fighting about when they do reconciliation bills.
Well, how often are portions of reconciliation bills stricken under the invocation of the Byrd rule?
It used to be that most of the Byrd rule challenges happened on the Senate floor, and so committees would do their work. A reconciliation bill would come to the floor, and then some provisions would get stricken because people would raise points of order under the Byrd rule. The way the bills are processed now is a little different, and I'd say at least for the last 10 to 15 years. Now, most of the scrubbing of the bill for whether there are Byrd rule violations happens before the bill ever gets to the floor. And that is a process that is started occurring last year when members knew that they were going to have the opportunity to do a reconciliation bill in this coming Congress. They started working on provisions and have started having conversations with the Senate parliamentarian and others, Senate Budget Committee, CBO, to try to determine, okay, how do we make whatever proposal that we want to do, how do we make it appropriate for reconciliation? Vis-a-vis, does it pass all of the Byrd tests? And so for the most part now, bills, by the time they get to the Senate floor, are scrubbed and they're clean of any violations. But what that means is a lot of stuff falls out before they ever get there.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you that. I mean, because obviously there's something very much Well, I mean, maybe I'm assuming the question is something broken with the budgetary process. I mean, the federal government is massive, we could debate whether or not that's a good or bad thing. Um, Clearly, we are spending more money than we're taking in, and there are lots of ways to focus on that issue. But either way, there's got to be some kind of fiscal discipline that is put out there. And so how do we get to that point?
Well, that is a very big question, and one that I completely share your sort of frustration with.
I guess hold on for a second, Hazen, because I'm asking because I mean, if we think about the history of the Budget Act, and the whole purpose of it was to sort of before the Budget Act, you just had the executive branch presenting their budget to Congress, and Congress sort of looking at it, and sort of we could talk about whether or not it was an up or down vote. I mean, there was an examination. We don't have a line item veto with this process. And so you have Congress that presents its own sort of version of this. And I will admit to everybody out there, when I was getting my master's in public administration, federal budgeting issues were not my strong suit. I was more on the regulatory side. The point is, at the end of the day, we all know that there is a problem here. One would have thought that the act would have fixed it, maybe, as you were talking about, in terms of dealing with deficit reductions for the first 20 or so years of the act's existence. It was going down that road, but then it started to change. I'm sorry, this is kind of a ramble soliloquy here. Your thoughts. That's why I asked the question.
No, not at all. The process is ridiculously broken, and again, I've worked more than 30 years of my career on budget issues, and it has been sad to see that happen, because it used to be that passing a budget, Congress passing a budget every year was just an assumption that was going to happen.
Yeah.
But in the last 20 years, that more often than not, Congress doesn't pass a budget, and the only times that they have in recent years is because they wanted to do a reconciliation bill. So when we wanted to do Obamacare repeal and replace in 2017 and tax reform, we passed budget resolutions that year, but they were solely to give us the instructions to do the reconciliation bills that we wanted to do. When the Democrats passed budget resolutions in 2021, the only reason they passed those budgets was to do the American Recovery Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. They didn't pass a budget for the purpose that it was intended, which was we should have a process to try to get our spending and revenue in line. They passed it purely for the purpose of creating this privileged vehicle to enact their agenda. Now, I can't necessarily blame them for that, because if it's there, you can expect that anybody who has a trifecta to try to use that power. But the focus on the budget and deficits has completely fallen off the face of the earth over the last few years. And there are a number of members of Congress who are trying to get that focus back. And I very much hope that they're successful this next go round.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it gets to the sort of the seminal issue about, perverse disincentives within, public policy, right? You create a policy. So this Budget Act, alongside the Byrd Rule, which essentially, helps to manage the process, but then it creates these perverse disincentives to the point where it gets used only when you want to, enact policy determinations, and everything else gets thrown away. I mean, here's the thing, and this is going to be out of left field, and if we don't want to talk about it, you just tell me you don't want to talk about it. One of the things that I've been interested in for a very long time is the impact of the 17th Amendment on all of this. And not that I sort of want to go down and have that role. That, for the uninitiated, that's the amendment which created the direct election of senators. Before then, senators were selected out of the state legislatures and were responsive to state legislative bodies. I mean, is some of this, this issue of the lack of fealty to, creating an annual budget. Is some of this possibly to blame because of the lack of accountability as a result of the 17th Amendment, or am I overstating that's importance?
I wouldn't have thought of that as a motivation. I mean,
Yeah.
my experience in the Senate is that most members are they do vote and stick pretty close to their state's interests, and
Sure.
so I think from that perspective they would pretty much vote the same either
Right.
way. I think it's more just a reflection of politics in general
Right.
that deficit reduction is hard and
Yeah.
painful, and there's it's been a long time since there has been any political reward for being fiscally responsible. A lot of members' constituents would say, yes, I want you to be fiscally responsible. But when they're then presented with the options of here's what that's going to mean to you, you might lose some benefits. You might pay a little higher taxes. You might have to pay a fee on something. Then suddenly that support shifts. And the one thing about the budget process, it is broken, but I've also sort of come to the conclusion after many, many years that you can't build a mousetrap to force Congress to do things that it doesn't want to do. At the end of the day, there has to be the political will to reduce deficits. And we have not gotten to that place yet. It's frightening that we haven't, because we're on a path that's completely unsustainable, and we're going to be spending more on the net interest on the debt than we do on just about anything else very soon. But the political will has to be there. You can't create a process that will override what members voting in their own political interest.
Let's pull it back for a second, because I think it would be helpful to talk about your experiences. How did you come to be a Senate staffer? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to college? How'd you wind up in DC?
Well, I grew up on a wheat and cattle farm in Hennessy, Oklahoma.
Okay.
Went to Oklahoma State, where I was an ag econ major. And I asked my advisor one day what I might be able to do for a summer internship, because I desperately did not want to go home and work on the harvest. And he said, well, a lot of people like to go to DC and work for, intern for members of Congress. So I sent at that time my resume to a Senator, Don Nichols from Oklahoma, who was elected in the Reagan landslide. And I found out later I got chosen. They'd already picked their interns, but they were working on the farm bill that summer, and they wanted someone from a farm community to work with their ag staffer. So I got picked, and as has happened to many, many people, when you come work on the Hill, if that's it has a way of sort of capturing your imagination, and it did for me. And I knew I wanted to come back and work on the Hill. So I ended up coming back and working for Senator Nichols for 17 years on the Hill.
Wow.
And then he and I, when he retired in 2004, we started a consulting company together, the Nichols Group, which he's still at. So I started as his ag guy, but I picked up the budget and tax issues pretty early in my career, and that was where the things I enjoyed the most. Then I came back and did a second tour of duty with Leader McConnell.
Got it. You were drawn back to the Hill for that in what was fascinating times, certainly.
Yes.
No, it's just you find that niche. I've when I was working at NFIB, friends who'd come off the Hill, they'd found their way into being healthcare policy people. My own, sort of finding my way into the regulatory side of things. I mean, let's talk about how the Hill and how those relationships have changed over time, because you've worked in a variety of different environments up on the Hill. Talk about how the atmosphere has changed, the sense of collegiality has changed. How have things changed over the last 30 years?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the Senate and I guess I could say the House too, but I spent my entire career in the Senate, and it would probably be dangerous for me to talk about the House. The Senate used to be much more driven by regular order, and I think that produced better outcomes. I would say that no matter which party was in control, if you let the committees do their work and then put bills on the floor and allow amendments and let there be votes and let the chips fall where they may, you're going to end up with a better legislative product that is going to have ultimately more durability and more support. And what has happened over the years, and again, it's happened on both sides, is that at some point, leadership intervenes, or a group of members may intervene to say, no, I don't want to vote on this. I don't want this to happen, and so I'm going to shut things down. It does prevent. You can certainly prevent things from passing that way, because a determined minority in the Senate can stop pretty much whatever they want to stop. But when the process breaks down completely, then you don't get a budget done, you don't get appropriations bills done, and it all continues to pile up towards the end of the year, which then results in these omnibus measures that everybody hates, and leadership makes all of the decisions on those pretty much with the input of the chairman. But still, it's just a terrible way to do business.
I got another bit of a curveball here for you, because how much of this it gets driven? It used to be. And again, I've been in DC for over 30 years as well. Mm-hmm. And so it used to be that there was a fair amount of discipline in terms of getting the message out, right? You would go through leadership, and leadership would sort of craft the message. And it was very difficult. I mean, obviously, if you are a senator or you're a member of the House, you have relationships with your hometown papers. But the idea of a legislator being some kind of an influencer and having this direct feed to the activist base, good or bad, to be able to get and grandstand immediately. I mean, how has that changed the dynamic? If all of a sudden it's not just that one person can hold the process hostage or hijack it or however, and I'm using very negative language here. But if they'd done that years before, it might not have gotten out. It might not have lasted. But now, with the push of a button, somebody can get out there and make it impossible to engage in some kind of replace and repeal of Obamacare, or, get out there and engage in the kind of budgetary reforms that we need to have. So how has that changed over years?
Oh, well, I think that's been a huge part of it. And I think that's part of what leads, to the breakdown of the process. Is it is so much easier for one person or a small group of people to have a oversized impact on politically on an issue in such a way that it then, it frightens members away from doing things that before they might have been comfortable doing. You can look, no further back than at the end of last year when they first what they call it, Cramnibus, the CR omnibus that they filed. It got savagely attacked online, with some attacks which were 100% valid and a lot which weren't. And regardless of how you feel about whether it should have been, whittled down or not, one of the things that did, just for example, is there was a healthcare title in that bill which had substantial offsets, deficit reduction in it.
Yeah.
And And those all fell out because people wanted a smaller bill. And so oftentimes you have people who are complaining that they want deficit reduction. And then when it's presented to them, if it's not done in the right way, they're like, no, I don't want that after all.
But so let's talk about this because, again, as you're talking about the return to regular order and this idea of having multiple bills, I mean, it's not just that you get these omnibus bills, but then, if you have multiple reconciliation bills that are included in all of this, I mean, this changes the dynamics of everything. Talk about the offset. That's not the right word that I want to use there, but talk about the sort of the dynamics between the cromnibus, omnibus kinds of bills versus passing each of these budget bills individually. Talk about that.
Well, it's a lot of the things, pretty much 95% of the things that were in that bill were things that were expiring. And so they were things that had to be done, but which should have been done earlier in the year. And so it very much gets back to the regular order process. Had there been a real live appropriations process throughout the course of this last year, where the House and Senate both passed bills, conferenced them, even if they hadn't have gotten all the way to final passage, at least both chambers would have had a chance to weigh in on the substance.
Right.
And members would have felt confident that, okay, this is something I've seen before. Even if you pass it at the end of the year, I'm comfortable with it. But hopefully, if you follow a regular order process, you don't have them all piling up at the same time, and that's what creates the anxiety of people not wanting to do these bills. Now, a lot of it is their own fault as well, because they only pass things with short-term tenure. So a lot of the health provisions which were expiring, they're only extended until March. Had they done the other bill, they would have been extended to at least 2 years. So you would have put that decision off, because every time there's an expiration, it creates an opportunity both to do good things and an opportunity for mischief. And so the creation of deadlines is something that Congress likes to do to give itself a reason to do more things.
It's funny because I was faced with this position and an issue that I was dealing with on the healthcare side of things, and there was a fix in the cramnibus that I was happy about. It wasn't perfect, but it was at least a step in the right direction. And then all of a sudden, we get word of everything else that's coming out. So you have to, be in the horrible position of saying, okay, I'm in favor of X, but I have to urge everybody to vote against Y because, Y in the aggregate stinks. So this is part of the problem here. But let's talk about the issue politically of going down this road of having multiple reconciliation bills. Let's talk about the political and procedural dynamics of doing this.
Sure. So this is something that, or the procedural scenario that this 119th Congress is facing is similar to what we had when I was working for Leader McConnell in 2017.
Yeah.
The Congress the year before had not passed a budget resolution. And so we still had the ability to pass a budget resolution for the current fiscal year. So for this Congress, it's FY25. That's the fiscal year we're in right now.
Yeah.
To pass a budget resolution, and that could produce a reconciliation bill. But then the way the Budget Act was supposed to work was you should be working this year on next year's budget resolution. So Congress can then also pass in this same calendar year an FY26 budget and a FY26 reconciliation bill. So they have the ability procedurally to do 2 budgets, 2 reconciliation bills, same calendar year.
Wow.
And that was not a given back in 2017. We had to have long conversations with the parliamentarian to sort of walk through how this would work. But we ended up creating sort of a playbook when you're in this scenario to be able to do that. Now that led to The first reconciliation bill was Obamacare repeal and replace, which John McCain killed. And then the second one was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, tax reform, and which was successful. So so Democrats then in 2021 ran the same playbook against us. They had a trifecta. They did the same thing. Now their second reconciliation bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, lagged and was pushed into the following calendar year because they just didn't get Joe Manchin on board until then. So this Congress they have the ability to do this. Now the question is, do they have the political ability to pull it off? And that's the debate that you're seeing in the press right now. There are some who are advocating, let's do an initial reconciliation bill that's narrow, maybe just border security focused. Try to do it very quickly and put it on the president's desk, next month.
Sure.
And then follow that up with a second bill, which would be the tax extensions and everything else on their agenda. The president seems to have weighed in this weekend and said that he would prefer that they instead put it all in one bill. And I think, and that's where House leaders have been as well. And I think it's a lot of it is a reflection of they have such a narrow majority. Everything is going to be difficult. And do they want more? I think they feel like they want more moving pieces, more things that are popular, like the border security money tied with the tax provisions, some of which will be controversial. They want to have more ways to whip that bill when it comes to pass. Now, the downside of it is if you're going to put it all in one big, beautiful bill, that's going to take longer. And that's a lot of work, and it will take more time to get there.
It just seems to me that if you break the bills down right into more discrete eatable chunks, it makes it, yes, you have to have more votes, and there's a greater risk in having more votes, but it makes it more palatable in terms of building the coalitions necessary to get things done. I mean, that's maybe naivete, but again, just so you understand, my bailiwick has largely been in the regulatory, in the executive branch, and sort of how that works. But I'm sorry. So just take that with a grain of salt, as why I'm sort of expressing this, what should be painful naivete on these things. But the issue of discrete junks, your thoughts there?
No, I think that's my sense of it too. The bigger and more complex these bills get, the difficulty in passing them grows. I think with that,
right.
We experienced that in 2017. It took us too long to get the repeal and replace bill done, and there were lots of reasons for that. That the House had
not the least of which was we couldn't agree on what the problem was, and when you couldn't agree on what the problem was, you can't agree on what the solution is. So yeah,
well, true, and Republicans as a party haven't had a healthcare solution in years. We have lots of good ideas, but we don't have a comprehensive plan that everybody.
Listen. Let me just get on my soapbox for a second. Knowing a lot of the players that are involved in there, when you have the two basic camps, in terms of discussing what the problem is, and neither one can ever come to the table and sort of satisfy it, and reconcile it. Yeah, it becomes very, very, very much about. I mean, I know where I am. I mean, I'm a free marketeer who believes that we have a supply problem in the healthcare world. We need to be producing more doctors and more nurses and more physicians assistants. But there are other folks who think that it's a health insurance problem. So I'm willing to discuss, what contrasts me is I'm willing to discuss the insurance side of it. But we have to discuss the other thing. And I'm sorry, Hazen, I've hijacked it. Go ahead.
No. It's but it was all those things, and CBO was very difficult to work with because they had to remodel. They wanted to change their models every time we wanted to change something in our bill, and and the longer it drugged, the more opportunity there were for, the folks who opposed the Medicaid caps that we had in that bill. That was a big chunk of deficit reduction that is my biggest regret that we didn't get done. We had a chance to actually do Medicaid reform in that bill, but the opposition grew substantially in that time that we spent haggling over it, to the point where it fell apart. So I worry about that for this bill. I do think there is a lot of I think members are all on the same page when it comes to mostly to the certainly to increasing border security, in a lot of the energy things that they want to do. A lot of these are going to be more money than policy, because the policy often runs afoul of the Byrd rule. But and on the taxes, they're mostly going to be on the same page. There'll be some nuances that will be different. So if they can keep it still fairly focused to the things that are red meat, for both conferences, I think they can keep it together, but it's going to be a lot of work.
So you mentioned the Senate parliamentarian. Just give us the quick and dirty on the role that the Senate parliamentarian plays in all this.
Sure. So all of the rulings that are associated with considering a reconciliation bill in the Senate, they all flow from the Budget Act, but also from prior precedent. And past rulings that have happened in the Senate. All of that sort of knowledge base is kept by the Senate parliamentarian, and their job is to police the sort of the legislation when it comes to the Senate floor. Now, the way they do that is through the official way they do that is they advise whoever's sitting in the Senate chair when a point of order is raised as to whether or not the point of order, is well taken or not. Yeah. And then the Senate has a chance to vote. That's their sort of official role. Their unofficial role, which is far more engaged, is they work with the House or with the Senate Budget Committee and all the Senate authorizing committees leading up to the bill being on the floor to help them vet the legislation so that when it comes to the floor, it's in compliance with the rules. And that often even extends to, what the House is sending to the Senate. So there have been a couple of times in recent history where the Senate has taken up a House reconciliation bill has taken it directly to the Senate floor and then offered a substitute, rather than going through the Senate committees. And in cases like that, the Senate parliamentarian has to look at the House bill and determine, it doesn't have to be completely free of all Byrdable provisions, but it can't have anything in it that is sort of outrageously outside of the scope of reconciliation. Or they can actually deem that it is not privileged, that it's not a reconciliation bill. So the parliamentarian has a great deal of power. It is not a power which they sought or would or want to have. It's power that the law has given them and the institution has given them. I would say Elizabeth McDonough, who's been the Senate parliamentarian for a long time now, and her deputy Lee and their whole team, they do an amazing job. When they vet these bills, they actually have committee councils for both the proponents and opponents of the bill will write memos on why their piece of the legislation is appropriate. They read those. They then have meetings with both sides, and eventually they have what is almost akin to a moot court, where they meet in the same room and they hear arguments from both sides before they make their decisions. They've done this now over the course of many years. They're now experts on just about every policy you could possibly think of, because it's all come in front of them at one time or the other, and they don't just look at it from a procedural standpoint. They dig into it and try and understand what's the policy that you're trying to accomplish here, and is it appropriate for reconciliation? And so I think do a great job, but it's a terrible position for them to be in. Yeah, to have to make some of these calls.
It's an incredibly important and powerful role that very few people know about. I mean, again, I can get into the arcana of the regulatory process and administrative courts and how that works. But on the one hand, I'm happy that there's someone who's there acting as sort of the arbiter and is being thoughtful about this in an area in which I recognize how important the deliberative process is. Maybe that's part of my problem is that I believe in greater deliberation, but boy, oh boy. So let's talk about this before I let you go. I do 3 podcasts. My listeners have heard me say this before. I had at one point been thinking about doing a podcast called Outside Interests, in which I talk to folks like you, folks who have been involved in or are involved in politics and policy, about the things that they do or that they love that have nothing to do with politics and policy. And some of it is, I'm sure Jim Neal. Jim Neal is an avid guitar player, and he was one of my thoughts of somebody I would have on to talk about what he wants to do. Somebody else I know does telecom policy, but he plays blues harmonica in a blues band. So when you're not doing this work, what are some of your outside interests?
I wish I was a blues harmonica player. That's what
that's
what I wish I was doing.
I wish I could play anything, but yes, I get that.
Well, I have my wife and I have a home over on the Eastern Shore in Oxford, Maryland.
I know it well.
My mother-in-law lives there full time, and so we like to.
Time out for a second. I lived in Queen Anne's County for 10 years before I moved elsewhere. So I was up in Centerville, so I know that neck of the woods very, very well. Go ahead. I apologize for interrupting.
No, so we spend as much time over there as we can. It's as you drive across the Bay Bridge and you can just kind of feel the stress melt away from 100%. The DC world. But we have a boat over there that we like to take out with family and friends, and so certainly during the summertime that's a big focus for us, is just spending time on the water and like to fish and pull the nephews on the tube and all that kind of good stuff.
Nice. It's so funny. My girls, they when we get the chance. In fact, it's so funny. We were up in the DC area. My older daughter is now working in DC, and we went up there for a thing, and we said, something, we got a spare afternoon. We went across the bridge and first up to Centerville for lunch, and then down to Easton to bop around a little bit. So I know it well. Hazen, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Oh, you're welcome. Our guest has been Hazen Marshall. He's the founding partner of Marshall & Pop, one of Washington's leading policy experts, especially on the issues of budget and reconciliation. This brings us to the close of yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As I've said, if you're listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms, you can check us out on our YouTube channel, subscribe, leave a comment, like us, and most importantly, let your friends and family members know all about the lunch hour and how much you enjoy it. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.